Coralie Kessler thought betrayal would be loud. She thought it would arrive as a slammed door, a raised voice, one unforgivable sentence she could point to years later and name for exactly what it was. She had spent 73 years preparing for the loud version. She had no defense for the quiet one. The quiet one arrived on a Tuesday in November, wearing her eldest son's practical voice and her daughter's clipboard and her youngest son's inability to meet her eyes. It arrived in the living room of the farmhouse where she had lived for 46 years, at the oak table where she had served 10,000 meals, in the exact chair where her husband Ansel had sat the morning before. The stroke took him 18 months earlier. "This is temporary," Darrow said. He was standing at the head of the table, her chair. He had taken her chair without asking and did not notice. Darrow was 49, broad, competent, the kind of man who entered rooms with the assumption that his presence rearranged the priorities inside them. "The facility has excellent staff," Celeste said. She was seated beside Darrow, with a manila folder open in front of her. Celeste was 46. She handled paperwork with a precision that Coralie once admired and now recognized as something colder. The documents in that folder had already been signed. Vaughn stood near the kitchen doorway. 43. Hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. He had not spoken since arriving. Vaughn had always been the one who felt things most and did the least about it. Guilt sat on him like a coat he could not take off but refused to acknowledge wearing. "You fell twice this month, Mom," Darrow continued. "The stairs are a liability. The furnace is unreliable. You can't keep driving. We've looked at this from every angle." Every angle except hers. Coralie noticed that. She noticed the way her children spoke about her in the second person. "You can't, you shouldn't, you need," as if the woman they were describing were a case file rather than the person sitting across from them. She noticed the way Darrow and Celeste exchanged looks above her head, small confirming glances that communicated agreement without including her in the conversation. She noticed that nobody had asked what she wanted, not once, not even as a formality. She opened her mouth to say something. She was not sure what, a protest, a question, maybe just the word wait, as spoken the way a person says it when they feel the current pulling them toward a decision they have not agreed to. But before the word arrived, Celeste placed a brochure on the table. Briar Glen Nursing Center. The cover showed a smiling, white-haired woman holding tea in a sunlit room. The room was beige. The smile was professional. "It's only 20 minutes from here," Celeste said. "We can visit any time." The word anytime. Coralie heard it the way you hear a lock engaging from the wrong side of a door. Anytime meant occasionally. Occasionally meant less. She was being relocated from the center of a family to its edge, and the relocation was being packaged as care. She looked at Vaughn. He was still staring at the floor. His jaw was working. His hands were fists inside his pockets. He knew. Joanne, she could see it in the architecture of his guilt. He knew this was wrong, and he was going to let it happen anyway, because opposing Darrow required a kind of courage that Vaughn had spent his entire life failing to locate. Coralie did not argue. That was her flaw. She had spent a lifetime smoothing conflict before it could fully arrive, and now, at the moment it mattered most, the habit held. She did not shout. She did not cry. She sat in the chair that was no longer hers at the table that would soon be sold in a house that her children had already decided she was finished living in, and she said nothing. By the following Friday, she was in the beige room at Briar Glen with a suitcase of clothes, 3 framed photographs, and a quilt she had sewn 23 years ago. The room smelled like disinfectant and the particular absence of personality that defines every space in a place where nothing belongs to you. By the following Monday, the farm was being emptied behind her back. And Coralie, sitting on the edge of a bed that smelled like disinfectant and other people's endings, understood for the first time that her children had not stopped loving her. They had simply stopped seeing her. And in a family, those two things can coexist for years before anyone notices the difference. The oak table sold first. Coralie learned this from a nurse named Patty, who overheard Celeste on the phone in the hallway during a Tuesday visit. Patty was not supposed to repeat it. She repeated it anyway. Because nurses in care facilities develop a radar for the specific kind of family cruelty that hides inside administrative language. And Patty had seen enough to know that when adult children sell a parent's furniture before the parent has finished grieving the house, something deeper than decluttering is happening. "Your daughter mentioned the table went to a dealer in Chillicothe," Patty said. "I thought you should know." Coralie did not respond immediately. She was sitting in the chair beside her window, which overlooked a parking lot and a strip of brown grass and a dumpster that the facility had tried to hide behind a wooden fence that was too short. The view was the architectural equivalent of the word "meanwhile." Something happening nearby that had nothing to do with you. The oak table. Ansel had built it the year Darrow was born. You're using lumber from a black walnut that fell during the ice storm of 1976. The surface was scarred with knife marks and water rings, and one deep gouge where Vaughn, at age 4, had tried to carve his name with a screwdriver. That table had held every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every late-night conversation between a husband and wife who understood that marriage was not romance-sustained, but patience accumulated. The tools went next. Ansel's entire workshop, auctioned at a county sale that Darrow organized in under 2 weeks. Socket sets, table saw, drill press, the hand planes Ansel's father had used. Coralie learned about that from a church friend who saw the listing online and called to ask whether she was okay, which is the question people ask when they already suspect the answer is no. Then the cattle trailer, the tractor, the canning shelves from the basement, the kitchen hutch that had belonged to Coralie's grandmother, a woman named Rosalie Emmerich, who had carried it across 2 state lines in 1931 and never let anyone put a wet glass on it without a coaster. Each item that disappeared removed a specific gravity from Coralie's interior. Not the monetary value, the weight, the proof. These objects were evidence that she had lived a particular life in a particular place with a particular man, and without them she became lighter in a way that felt less like freedom and more like evaporation. She was being erased in installments, and each installment was explained to her as practicality. Celise called on a Thursday to say the process was going smoothly. She used the word streamlined. She said the realtor was encouraged by buyer interest. She said Darrow had gotten a fair price for the tractor. Each sentence was constructed with the careful neutrality of a person who has learned to describe theft in the language of asset management. "Is there anything you want us to hold on to?" Celise asked. The question sounded generous. It was not. It was a closing gesture, the verbal equivalent of handing someone a single box and telling them to choose which pieces of their life fit inside it. Celise was not offering preservation. She was offering a receipt for what had already been decided. Coralie said, "The quilt is here." "Good, that's good, Mom." After the call, Coralie sat in the chair by the window and looked at the parking lot. A delivery truck was backing toward the kitchen entrance. An aide was smoking near the fence. The dumpster was overflowing with cardboard. Everything in her field of vision belonged to someone else's system, and she was inside it now, processed and placed and expected to adjust. She could not decide what hurt more, losing the objects or realizing her children had done it with the confidence of people who were certain she no longer had the authority to object. That certainty was the worst part. It was not cruelty. It was something more durable than cruelty. It was assumption. They had assumed her silence was agreement. They had assumed her grief was confusion. They had assumed that because she did not fight, she did not mind. And the most painful question Coralie carried into that night, the one that pressed against her chest like a stone she could not shift, was whether they were entirely wrong. Or had she spent a lifetime teaching her children that her silence could be mistaken for consent? That question did not let her sleep. It sat beside her in the dark the way only self-knowledge sits. Heavy, unfinished. True. Before we go any further, I need you to answer something honestly. When was the last time you made a decision about someone you love, not with them, but for them, and told yourself it was care? When was the last time you looked at your mother, your father, the person who built the life you are standing in, and decided what they needed without once asking what they wanted? If that question puts pressure behind your eyes right now, do not look away from it. Subscribe so this story finds you again. And stay, because what happens next to Coralie is what happens when a woman stops agreeing to disappear. June Talbert arrived at Briar Glen on a Saturday morning carrying a paper sack of homemade rolls and the kind of honesty that most people find uncomfortable and Coralie had spent a lifetime avoiding. June was 71, thick-armed, silver-haired in a way that did not apologize for itself. She had lived down the county road for 40 years and operated on a social principle that Coralie had always envied but never adopted. Say what you see and let other people decide if they can handle it. June did not translate selfishness into stress. She did not excuse cruelty by calling it family complexity. She said things the way they were and let the air deal with the aftermath. She sat in the chair beside Coralie's bed, placed the rolls on the nightstand, and looked at her friend with the frank assessment of a woman who had been watching this situation develop for months and had decided that silence was no longer acceptable. "They stripped the place too fast," June said. Coralie's hand stilled in her lap. "I drove by Thursday. The house is nearly bare. Darrow had a crew in the barn clearing equipment. I talked to one of the workers, a man named Guthrie I know from church. He said they pulled everything they could reach and hauled it to auction." Coralie listened. Her body was very still, the way bodies become when they are absorbing information that has weight. "But here's the thing," June continued. She leaned forward slightly. "Guthrie told me they tried removing an old feed partition along the back wall of the barn. The boards sounded hollow. Darrow told them not to waste time. Oh, said the rest was junk. Clear what you can reach, he said. They left it. Hollow. The word landed differently than it should have. Words like hollow usually mean empty, but Coralie heard it the way a person hears a door handle turning in a room they thought was locked. Not empty, enclosed. Something on the other side. She did not react outwardly. June watched her face and saw the stillness change from passive to active, the way water changes from still to taut just before the surface breaks. "You know something," June said. Not a question. Coralie looked at her hands. They were folded in her lap the way she always folded them when she was deciding whether to speak or to keep smoothing. Folded hands had been her default position for decades. The posture of a woman who had turned conflict avoidance into a life skill and was only now beginning to understand the cost. She had spent her entire marriage letting Ansel handle the hard conversations. She had spent her widowhood letting her children handle the decisions. She had spent her time at Briar Glen letting the routine handle her days. At every stage, she had traded her own authority for the comfort of not having to defend it. June sat quietly. She did not push. She was the kind of friend who understood that some truths need to arrive at their own speed, and that rushing a woman toward a realization she has been avoiding for 73 years does not make the realization arrive faster. It just makes it arrive angry. Coralie unfolded her hands. "Ansel used to say something," she said slowly, "about paper mattering more than silver, about fools always searching the obvious places." June tilted her head. Waited. "There might be something behind the barn," Coralie said. "Not inside it, behind it. Something my children don't know about." The room was quiet. The fluorescent light hummed above them. Down the hall, a television was playing a game show at a volume designed for people whose hearing had been dimming for years. The beige curtains moved slightly from the air vent. June looked at her friend. Then she picked up one of the rolls, tore it in half, and handed Coralie the larger piece. "Then we better figure out how to get you back there," she said. And for the first time in months, something in Coralie's chest shifted. Not hope, exactly. Something more dangerous than hope. Something closer to refusal. And memory did not arrive like lightning. Not at Coralie's age. It arrived like something rising through deep water. Vague at first, then assembling itself piece by piece until the shape became undeniable, and she could not understand how she had ever let it sink. She lay awake in the Briar Glen bed that night. The mattress was too soft. The sheets were institutional. The pillow smelled like commercial laundry detergent and the particular absence of personality that defines every object in a place where nothing belongs to you. Through the window, she could see the parking lot lights casting orange circles on the asphalt, and beyond them, nothing. Just Ohio dark. The kind of dark that used to feel like privacy when she lived inside it and now felt like erasure. Ansel, late 1970s. She placed the memory carefully, either way you place a cracked dish on a counter so it does not break further. Vaughn was still in diapers. Darrow was maybe 10. Celise somewhere in between. Ansel had come into the kitchen from the barn with mud on his boots and an expression that sat between anger and resolution. His younger cousin, a man named Lyle Hooper, had gotten drunk the night before and broken into the smokehouse and stolen 4 cured hams and a box of Ansel's mother's silver. Ansel did not call the police. In that part of Ohio, family theft was handled inside the family, which usually meant it was not handled at all. But something changed in Ansel after that night. He became quieter about certain things, more deliberate. He started moving items around the property in patterns that looked random, but she now understood were not. "Paper matters more than silver," he said one evening, standing at the kitchen sink, washing his hands the slow way he washed them when he was thinking. "And fools always search the obvious places." She had not asked what he meant. That was the habit. Ansel spoke in conclusions, not explanations, and Coralie had learned to let his statements settle like weather rather than pressing for the forecast. She trusted him the way she trusted the structure of the house itself, without examining the foundations because the floors felt solid underfoot. Now, lying in a bed that was not hers, in a room that smelled like somebody else's disappearance, she examined the foundation, behind the barn, not inside it. Behind it, where the slope dropped toward the tree line and wild blackberry canes grew in dense walls every summer. There had been an old storm door built into that slope, a cellar entrance from an earlier structure that predated the current barn by decades. Ansel's grandfather had used it for root storage. By the time Coralie married into the family, the door was already buried under vine and warped boards and the accumulated indifference of people who had stopped needing what was underneath. The children never knew about it. By the time they were old enough to explore, the blackberry canes had swallowed the entrance completely, and Ansel never mentioned it the way he never mentioned most things that he considered settled. He was a man who trusted silence the way other men trusted safes. He believed that the best protection for something valuable was not a lock, but irrelevance. If nobody knew it existed, nobody would try to take it. But Ansel had gone down there. Coralie remembered now. Not often. Maybe 4 or 5 times across the years. Always alone. Always returning with mud on his knees and the particular satisfaction of a man who has checked on something and found it undisturbed. She never asked. He never offered. It was one of those married silences that couples accumulate over decades, the kind that feel comfortable until one person dies and the other realizes the silence was holding information she needed. She needed it now because the farm was being sold. The house was nearly empty. The barn had been stripped. And somewhere behind that barn, under vine and warped wood, and 40 years of deliberate forgetting, was a door that her children did not know existed. The next morning, Coralie did something she had never done. She asked the Briar Glen administrator, a woman named Dorrit Calloway, to help her contact the county ombudsman. Not her children, the ombudsman. Her voice shook, and that angered her because fear and age often sound identical to strangers, and she needed this woman to hear the difference. She was not confused. She was not having an episode. She was a woman who had been moved out of her own house, watched her belongings sold without consent, and was now asking for the only kind of help her children had not already intercepted. "Please," Coralie said, "I need someone who is not family." Dorrit removed her glasses, put them back on. Then she picked up the phone. The county sedan pulled into the farm driveway on a Thursday morning that smelled like cold mud and the last of the season's fallen leaves rotting quietly into the soil. Coralie sat in the back seat. Her hands were in her lap, folded the way she always folded them, except now the fold felt different. tighter, less like a habit and more like a fist wrapped in politeness. Beside her was the ombudsman, a woman named Estelle Brandt who was 52 and calm in the way people become calm when their work requires them to remain steady inside other people's emergencies. Estelle carried a leather portfolio and a county ID badge clipped to her jacket. June Talbert followed in her own truck. She had insisted. "Witnesses matter," she said, "especially the kind that don't owe anybody in the room a thing." The farm looked wrong from the driveway, not damaged, diminished. The porch was bare where rocking chairs had sat. The windows reflected gray sky instead of warm light. The house looked like a face that had stopped expressing anything. Darrow was on the porch before the sedan stopped, arms crossed, legs slightly apart, the posture of a man establishing territory. "Mom, you didn't need to do all this," he said as Coralie stepped out. His voice carried the warm register of a man who has learned that concerned tones and controlling behavior can share the same sentence. "I need some personal papers from the house," Coralie said. Simple, undeniable. You could not refuse a woman access to her own documents without revealing that the refusal was about something other than documents. Celise appeared in the doorway. "Of course, Mom. Whatever you need. You should have just called." Should have just called. The sentence meant, the system we built to manage you has a protocol, and you violated it. Your Vaughn was near his truck at the edge of the gravel. He had not approached. Hands in his jacket, head lowered. He looked physically unwell. Of the three, Vaughn carried the weight of what they were doing in his body rather than his arguments, and his body was losing. Coralie did not go inside the house. She walked past Darrow, past Celise, past the bare porch, and the steps where Ansel used to sit on July evenings, watching fireflies rise from the pasture. She walked toward the barn. "Mom, where are you going?" The first real alarm in Darrow's voice. Not concern, alarm. The sound a man makes when a situation he has controlled begins moving in a direction he did not plan. Coralie did not answer. June fell into step beside her. Estelle followed. The barn was gutted, wide doors open, bare concrete stained with oil and hay dust, stalls empty, or a loft cleaned out. The building had been hollowed from the inside, and the emptiness echoed differently than silence. This was the sound of a space that had held 40 years of purpose and been stripped clean in 2 weeks. Coralie walked past it. Around the back, the ground sloped toward the tree line. Blackberry canes grew thick along the hillside, their thorns catching her coat as she pushed through. The ombudsman steadied her elbow. June used a stick to push the worst of the canes aside. The ground was muddy and uneven, and Coralie felt her balance waver twice, but she did not stop. She had been stopped for months. She was finished with stopping. And there, hidden beneath vine and warped boards and decades of deliberate forgetting, was the outline of a door. A storm door, built into the slope. Set at an angle the way cellar entrances were built 100 years ago, when people stored what mattered underground, because the ground was the only thing they trusted to keep still. Darrow had followed. He stopped at the edge of the thicket. "That's nothing, just a collapsed storage cut." "Mom, you're going to hurt yourself." Coralie looked at the door, the rusted latch still intact under the vine, the warped boards that had been covering it longer than her children had been alive. Then she looked at Darrow, and something inside her went very calm, not peaceful, calm. The specific calm of a woman who has spent 73 years smoothing other people's discomfort and has just decided, standing on a muddy hillside with thorns in her coat, to stop. She gripped the latch with both hands. Rust bit into her palms. She pulled. It held, while June reached over and gripped the doorframe. Together they pulled, and the latch broke free with a sound that echoed off the barn wall. Cold air breathed out from the dark below. Stone steps descended into a space Coralie had not entered in over 40 years. And standing at the top of those steps, with her children's voices rising behind her and her dead husband's words rising inside her, Coralie understood that whatever waited at the bottom had been waiting for exactly this moment. the moment she stopped asking permission to exist inside her own life. The first step down was stone, cold under Coralie's shoe, slick with the kind of moisture that accumulates in places sealed long enough to develop their own weather. She gripped the door frame and lowered herself onto the second step, then the third. The air rising from below smelled like damp earth, old iron, and something faintly chemical, the residue of preserved wood and rusted metal that had been breathing the same trapped air for decades. It was not the smell of rot. It was the smell of patience, the smell of a room that had been waiting. Behind her, Darrow's voice was sharp and escalating. "Mom, stop! You're going to fall. This is exactly why you're at Briar Glen. You can't just... Estelle, can you please tell her this is dangerous?" Estelle Brandt did not tell Coralie anything. She followed her down the steps with the portfolio under one arm and a flashlight she had retrieved from the sedan in the other. The beam cut through the dark and landed on the far wall, illuminating what the cellar actually was. Not a collapsed storage cut, not junk, a reinforced root cellar. Timber-framed walls lined with stone. Shelves along both sides holding canning jars clouded with age, their contents long dried into amber sediment behind the glass. Sealed tins stacked in rows. Wooden crates with stenciled labels. And in the back, against the far wall, a narrow workbench made of plank pine, scarred with tool marks and darkened by decades of oil and use. On the workbench sat a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Coralie crossed the cellar floor slowly. Her shoes scraped on the packed earth. The ceiling was low enough that Estelle had to duck slightly. The jars on the shelves watched like clouded eyes. The air was cold enough to make breathing visible, and Coralie could see her own breath leaving her body in small gray clouds that dissolved into the dark, the way her authority had been dissolving for months. Except now, while in this room, she was taking it back. She reached the workbench. She placed both hands on the oilcloth wrapping. The fabric was stiff with age but intact. Ansel had wrapped this box the way he wrapped everything, completely without gaps, as if thoroughness were a moral principle rather than a habit. She unwrapped it. The metal box was a fireproof document case, olive green, the kind sold at hardware stores in the 1970s for people who did not trust banks and did trust fire. The latch was simple. It opened with a click that sounded unreasonably loud in the silence of the cellar. Inside were documents, not treasure, not gold coins or forgotten cash, or anything that would satisfy a person looking for a story about instant wealth. Documents, paper, the kind of material that most people throw in a drawer and forget. But that Ansel Kessler had understood was the only thing standing between his wife and the particular kind of helplessness that arrives when someone else controls your records. Deeds. 3 of them. Recorded with the county recorder's office, stamped, notarized, and filed with the precision of a man who understood that paper, properly maintained, is harder to steal than silver. Survey maps, hand-drawn but professionally measured, showing boundary lines, acreage calculations, and parcel numbers that did not match the property listing Darrow had been using to sell the farm. Lease packets, an old gas easement agreement from 1968, signed by Ansel's father, granting surface access to a pipeline company in exchange for a small annual royalty. The royalty was still active, still being paid, into an account none of the children knew existed, and ledger books. 3 of them. Ansel's handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, payments received, taxes paid, a meticulous record of a financial life that existed underneath the visible one, maintained for decades in a cellar nobody visited. Coralie turned the pages slowly. Her hands were steady now. The shaking that had plagued her at Briar Glen, the tremor her children interpreted as frailty, was gone. Her fingers moved across the entries the way a musician's fingers move across an instrument they have not played in years but never forgot. Darrow had come halfway down the stairs. He stood on the 4th step with one hand on the wall, his head bent under the low ceiling. His expression had changed. The irritation was still there, but underneath it something else was forming. Then something that looked like the first structural crack in a wall built from certainty. "What is that?" he asked. Coralie did not answer. She was reading a deed dated 1981 that separated 12 wooded acres, a spring parcel, and a small royalty interest from the main farm property and placed them in her name. Solely, individually, not jointly held, not part of the marital estate that her children had been liquidating. Hers. She looked up at Darrow from the workbench. She held the deed in the light of Estelle's flashlight so both of them could see the signatures. Ansel's. Hers. The notary stamp from the county seat. The recording number from the recorder's office. "This," Coralie said quietly, "is what your father hid from fools who searched the obvious places." Estelle Brandt began photographing the documents at 11:42 that morning. Kneeling on the cellar floor, with her phone angled against the flashlight beam, capturing each page with the methodical pace of a woman who understood that evidence, once documented, becomes very difficult to make disappear. Darrow watched from the stairs. His arms were no longer crossed. They hung at his sides the way arms hang when the posture holding them up has been removed. The confidence he had carried onto the porch 2 hours earlier, the confidence of a man who believed he was managing a situation rather than creating one, was dissolving in real time. Each photograph Estelle took removed another brick from the structure of his certainty. Celise had come down the steps by now. She stood near the bottom with her fleece zipped to her chin and her arms wrapped around herself. Not from cold, but from the particular physical contraction that occurs when a person realizes they may be in legal trouble. She had handled the paperwork. She had signed the listing agreements. She had coordinated the auctions. If the property had been misrepresented, her signatures were on the misrepresentation. "I didn't know about this," she said. Her voice was flat, not defensive yet, just flat. The tone of a woman standing in the gap between what she believed and what the documents were now proving, trying to decide which direction to fall. Vaughn had not come down. He stood at the top of the steps in the daylight, looking down into the cellar the way a man looks into water he is afraid to enter. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His jaw was working. Of the three, Vaughn was the one who had known the longest that something was wrong, and his refusal to act on that knowledge was now standing in the same room with the proof that acting would have mattered. The ledger books told the full story. After a refinancing dispute in 1981, Ansel had separated the most stable portions of the land from the main farm parcel. The 12 wooded acres held valuable hardwood timber. The spring parcel provided water rights that had legal and commercial value. The gas easement royalty, though small, was consistent and had been deposited quarterly into a separate account at a bank in Chillicothe for over 40 years. None of this appeared on the property listing Darrow had prepared. The sale he was arranging treated the farm as a single unified parcel, which meant the buyer would have acquired land that was not Darrow's to sell, and the legal liability would have fallen on the family like a collapsing roof. Estelle finished photographing at 12:15. She stood up, brushed her knees, and looked at Coralie with the particular expression of a professional who has seen enough of these situations to know that the hardest part is not finding the evidence. It is watching the family absorb it. "These documents are valid," Estelle said. "The deeds are recorded. The separation is clean. The royalty account appears to be active. You have grounds to challenge the sale and recover control of the separated parcels." Coralie nodded. She was still seated at the workbench. The metal box was open in front of her. The ledger books were stacked beside it, and clipped to the inside cover of the last ledger, unfolded once and held in place by a rusted paper clip, was a letter. She recognized the handwriting before she unfolded it. Ansel's. Small. Deliberate. The handwriting of a man who measured his words the way he measured fence posts, not for beauty, but for accuracy. She unfolded the letter and read the first line. "If you're opening this, it means somebody started treating your life like leftover property." Coralie's breath stopped, not dramatically, quietly. The way breath stops when a sentence lands in the exact center of a wound you have been carrying for months, and names it with the precision of a man who knew you well enough to predict the injury before it happened. She kept reading. Don't rush. Don't surrender from embarrassment. And don't mistake being outnumbered for being wrong. Above her, the children were silent. Below her, where the cellar held its cold breath. And Coralie sat on the workbench stool with her dead husband's letter in her hands and felt, for the first time since he died, that someone was speaking directly to her rather than about her. Coralie read the letter 3 times on the cellar steps while the voices above her rose and fractured. Darrow was arguing with Estelle near the barn. His voice carried the particular urgency of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on belongs to someone else. Celise was on her phone, speaking in the low, rapid tone of a woman calling a lawyer before the situation gets worse. Vaughn had not moved from the top of the steps. He stood in the daylight, looking down at his mother sitting in the dark below him, and the distance between them was not 12 feet. It was the entire length of a relationship in which he had always known the right thing and never once done it. June Talbert stood at the top of the cellar entrance with her arms crossed and her back straight, positioned like a witness at a trial nobody expected to lose. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was the statement. She had seen. She had brought the truth to Coralie. She had driven here in her own truck and stood in the cold while a 73-year-old woman pulled a rusted latch open with her bare hands. June was not here to comfort. She was here to confirm. Coralie folded the letter and placed it inside her coat pocket, against her chest, where she could feel the paper crease against her sternum when she breathed. The letter was not long. Ansel was never a man of many words. Oh, but the words he chose had been selected with the care of a man who knew that someday his wife would be sitting in a cold room underground, holding a piece of paper, needing to hear his voice one more time. The deeper truth arriving in that cellar was not about land or deeds or royalties. It was about herself. She had spent years becoming smaller so that other people could feel more certain. She had translated Darrow's controlling nature into leadership. She had called Celise's coldness efficiency. She had forgiven Vaughn's cowardice by naming it sensitivity. She had performed these translations so many times and for so long that she had forgotten they were translations at all. She had mistaken her own accommodation for wisdom. And the cost of that mistake was a beige room at Briar Glen and a life being sold at auction while she watched from a window overlooking a dumpster. That was her flaw, not weakness. Generosity without boundaries. Love without a floor. The willingness to interpret every injury as a misunderstanding because the alternative, that the people she raised were capable of treating her like surplus property, was a truth too expensive to hold. Ansel's letter did not tell her to fight. It told her to stop agreeing. There is a difference between those two things that most people never learn because fighting is dramatic and stopping is quiet, and the world pays more attention to noise than to the moment a person simply decides to remain where they are and refuse to be moved. Coralie stood up from the cellar steps. She climbed to the top slowly, placed one hand on the stone wall, her knees protesting the way 73-year-old knees protest when asked to do something their owner has been told she cannot do. She emerged into the gray November daylight and blinked against it. Her 3 children were standing in a loose triangle near the barn. Darrow had stopped arguing. Celise had ended her phone call. Vaughn was looking at her now directly for the first time in months, and his face held an expression she had not seen since he was a boy caught doing something he knew was wrong, but hoped nobody noticed. Coralie looked at all 3 of them. She did not raise her voice. She did not deliver a speech. Real transformation does not arrive as performance. It arrives as posture, as the way a woman holds her shoulders after she has stopped carrying weight that was never hers to bear. "Mom, I'm not going back to Briar Glen," she said, "except to collect my things." Nobody argued, not because they agreed, because they recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the woman standing in front of them was not confused or fragile or in need of management. She was clear, and clarity, when it arrives in a person who has been underestimated for years, is more unsettling than anger. The elder law attorney's name was Margot Seiler, and she operated from a second-floor office in Chillicothe that smelled like old carpet and fresh coffee, and the particular variety of justice that moves slowly but does not stop once it starts. Margot was 61. sharp-faced. She wore reading glasses pushed up on her head and spoke in sentences that were short enough to be clear and long enough to be legally precise. She had spent 23 years representing clients whose families had made decisions for them without asking, and she recognized the pattern in Coralie's case before the first meeting was finished. "Your children had no authority to sell the separated parcels," Margot said. "The deeds are in your name alone. The royalty account is in your name alone. The wooded acres, the spring parcel, and the caretaker cottage near the tree line are not part of the marital estate and were never included in any power of attorney filing, because no power of attorney was ever filed." That sentence landed on the table between them like a stone dropped into still water. No power of attorney. Darrow had been making decisions about Coralie's property without any legal authorization to do so. He had assumed control the way he assumed everything, by walking into the room first and speaking loudest. And because Coralie had not objected, and because Celise had processed the paperwork without verifying the boundaries, and because Vaughn had looked away, the assumption had hardened into action, and the action had nearly become irreversible. Nearly. Margot filed a motion to freeze the pending sale within 48 hours. She contacted the buyer's attorney to disclose the boundary discrepancy. She initiated a formal complaint with the county ombudsman's office regarding the circumstances of Coralie's placement at Briar Glen, and she sent a certified letter to all 3 children informing them that further disposition of any property belonging to Coralie Kessler without her written, witnessed, and notarized consent would be treated as elder financial exploitation under Ohio Revised Code. The word exploitation arrived in Darrow's mailbox on a Tuesday. He did not call. Darrow had never been the kind of man who reaches out when his authority is challenged. He retreats. He recalculates. He waits for the architecture of his control to reassemble itself, and when it does not, he goes quiet in a way that is more unsettling than anger, because it suggests he is building something new to replace what collapsed. Celise received hers the same day. She called Margot's office, not Coralie. She wanted to negotiate. She wanted to discuss terms. She wanted to manage the situation the way she had managed every other situation in this family, with paperwork and distance and the clinical detachment of a woman who confuses administration with innocence. Vaughn received his and called Coralie that evening. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man who had been carrying something heavy for months and had just felt it shift to a position where he could no longer pretend it was not there. "Mom, I'm sorry." Coralie held the phone. She listened to the silence around those 2 words. She heard what was in it and what was missing. The apology was real, she believed that. Vaughn felt genuine remorse, but remorse without action is just a feeling that makes the person feeling it more comfortable without changing anything for the person they harmed. Vaughn was sorry. He had been sorry for months. Sorry had not stopped a single auction. Sorry had not prevented a single box from being loaded into a truck. Sorry had not kept her grandmother's hutch from being sold to a stranger in Chillicothe. "I know you are, Vaughn," she said, "but knowing what's right and doing what's right are not the same thing, and you have spent your whole life proving that." The silence that followed was the sound of a son receiving the truest thing his mother had ever said to him. Coralie did not win back the entire farm. That was not possible, and she did not try. The house sale was already in contract. The tools and furniture were gone. The tractor was gone. The grandmother's hutch was gone. Some losses, once completed, cannot be reversed. They can only be survived. But the 12 wooded acres were hers. The spring parcel was hers. The gas royalty was hers. And the caretaker cottage near the tree line, a small 2-room structure with a tin roof and a porch that listed to the east, was hers. Margot handed her the key on a Friday afternoon. Coralie held it in her palm. It was a brass key, small, ordinary, the kind of key that opens the kind of door most people walk past without noticing. She noticed. The cottage was modest and flawed, and Coralie loved it the way you love a thing that is yours after a long season of belonging to nothing. The roof sagged over the kitchen section, where a support beam had bowed under decades of snow weight. The sink leaked from a joint that had corroded green. The porch steps listed to the east at an angle steep enough to make visitors nervous, but not steep enough to qualify as dangerous. like the windows were single pane. The floor was pine. The walls were plaster over lath, cracked in 3 places and patched in none. It was hers. She moved in on a Saturday in December. June helped. Patty, the nurse from Briar Glen who had told her about the oak table, came on her day off and brought cleaning supplies and a casserole and the kind of practical friendship that does not require explanation because the explanation is in the showing up. The quilt went on the bed. The 3 photographs went on the dresser. The metal box from the cellar went under the bed, not because Coralie was hiding it, but because the documents inside had already done their work and now they could rest. Ansel's letter stayed in her coat pocket. She did not need to read it again. She had memorized it the way you memorize a sentence that saved your life. This is the first evening she sat on the crooked porch and listened to the frogs near the spring. The sound was enormous for something so small. Dozens of voices rising from the water in a chorus that had been performing every night for years, whether anyone was there to hear it or not. The frogs did not need an audience. They did not need permission. They did not need someone to tell them they were still alive. They simply were. Coralie understood that now. She had spent 18 months being discussed, arranged, relocated, and sold. She had watched her life converted into line items and auction lots. She had sat in a beige room and listened to her children make decisions about her future in voices that never once asked what she wanted, and she had allowed it. That was the part she could not set down. She had believed that love required her to become smaller whenever someone else needed room. Ansel's letter had not told her to fight. It had told her to stop agreeing, and the difference between those 2 things was the difference between the life she had been living and the life she was now beginning. She did not hate her children. She was not sure she would ever fully trust them again, but she did not hate them. Darrow would remain Darrow, competent, controlling, certain that his decisions were other people's best options. Celeste would process whatever came next with the same efficient detachment she had brought to the dismantling. Vaughn would carry his guilt like a low-grade fever, present enough to notice, never quite severe enough to force change. They were who they were. She had raised them. That truth was uncomfortable and permanent and hers to carry. But she was no longer carrying it inside their system. She was carrying it on her own porch, in her own cottage, on land that had her name on the deed and no one else's. The spring ran behind the house. The woods stood dark and steady against the winter sky. The frogs sang. She lay awake that first night under the quilt she had sewn 23 years ago, in a room that smelled like cold plaster and pine, and the first honest air she had breathed since Ansel died. The mattress was old. The pillow was flat. The roof made sounds she would need to learn. But the key was on the nightstand, and the door was hers to lock or unlock as she chose. And lying there in the dark, listening to the December quiet and the spring water and the settling sounds of a cottage learning to hold her weight, Coralie understood something she wished she had learned decades earlier. The most important door was not the one behind the barn. It was not the cellar hidden by blackberry canes and 40 years of forgetting. The most important door was the one she opened inside herself when she stopped smoothing other people's certainty and finally said the truest sentence of her life. I am not going back. Some inheritances are not money or land or documents in hidden rooms. Some inheritances are the moment a person refuses to let other people rename her life for convenience. If that truth moves something inside you tonight, if it reminds you of a woman whose silence was mistaken for agreement, share the story with someone who needs it. Drop a comment. Tell us who that person is. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We are here every week with stories of quiet strength and courage that does not shout but refuses to disappear. The next story is already waiting.